Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to start with a broad overview of methods and methodologies of ethnographic research. And then in the second video, we're going to focus on the two approaches that we recommend for your media, ethnographies, and digital artifacts in this subject. The important thing to remember is that ethnography is the systematic approach to describe and analyze experience. This means that ethnography is more than the sum of its methods and its methodologies. When I use the term method, I'm generally referring to the process of data collection. When I use the term methodology, I'm generally referring to the theoretical and paradigmatic framework that is used to analyze and interpret the data. However, as this lecture is going to show, these two terms significantly overlap in their meaning. The primary research method of ethnography has historically been observation and what's called field research. As I discussed last week, a field is a network of relations between human and non-human actors that includes actual physical spaces, virtual locations, and the various means that connect these actors together. Fieldwork involves making observations and collecting information about the field under investigation. A common form of ethnographic field research is participant observation. This is where the researcher is engaged with the activity going on in the field, and we'll come back to discussing this approach later. It's important to note that not all observation research has to be participatory, and the two different approaches will provide very different results. Another form of ethnographic research is the interview. Interviews are perhaps more familiar to you in the shape of journalistic interviews that are used to construct news and informational content. This goes to my point about the important role that ethnography plays in the production of media content. But journalist interviews typically employ a different kind of reflexivity and usually have a set of rigid editorial constraints that set them apart from what we would traditionally call ethnographic interviews. At its core, the interview is a question and response approach to collecting data. So we have surveys, questionnaires, and focus groups that are all considered a type of interview method, although they really are quite distinct tools and ways of eliciting responses from participants. Person-to-person interviews also vary significantly. A structured interview, for example, involves a set protocol which replicates the conditions and questions for each participant. It's usually conducted in a neutral space and every person is asked the same question, and in the same order, and given the same amount of time to respond. A semi-structured interview is less prescriptive, and while it usually follows a set protocol, which is a series of interview questions, there is opportunity for the researcher to ask follow-up questions, to make notes as the interview is proceeding, and then go back to those notes to seek clarification and ask for more detail. An unstructured interview is a long-form conversation. Many podcasts, for example, are a form of collective unstructured interview, where there may be a host talking to a guest or a regular group of podcasters taking turns to ask each other questions and respond. Again, demonstrating how effective ethnographic research methods are for generating media content. Interviews, especially semi-structured and unstructured, are often conducted in association with observational and participatory research, producing a mixed method approach to data collection. Interviews are usually recorded, either via audio or video or handwritten notes. The real work of the interviewer comes with transcription. The researcher, or someone paid by the researcher, will transcribe the interview. Some researchers prefer to do it themselves, others not, because it is an exceptionally time-consuming process, which makes transcription actually quite expensive. Once transcribed, the results can be added to a range of different software packages that will help to identify key trends through the process of analysis by coding associations between the results. Some will even automate the process through algorithmic analysis like sentiment analysis, which helps to identify the emotional content of responses. Following transcription and analysis, the researcher then assembles a case or an argument and presents the results through the paradigmatic process of interpretation, which is where the theoretical framework is important. Two other methods of ethnographic research are document research and case study research. These are ways of collecting materials that support other methods, including finding background information on the field sites and developing a close analysis of key elements of the research to support the methodological inquiry. There's a vast wealth of documentation available on the web in various archives that isn't just of use to historians, but can play an active and interesting role in the stories that ethnographers have to tell by expanding on details and revealing connections to the experience of others in different times and places that might be otherwise forgotten and overlooked. Under document research, we can also add the idea of mapping. As I mentioned last week, mapping is an incredible way to both generate and organize data and visually communicate your analysis and interpretation of that data. Remember, media ethnography is both the research method of investigating media use and the communication of that research through your digital artifacts to a public audience. And mapping is a highly effective way to do that. Historical maps are also a brilliant way of coming to terms with how people understood their world and their cultures in their time. I've put a link on the Moodle page to a clip from the Modern History TV that examines the Mappa Mundi, one of the oldest medieval world maps at Hereford Cathedral in the UK. This is more than a map. It's a narrative encyclopedia of what was known about the world at the time. I mentioned algorithmic analysis of interview results, and this connects to an experimental method that some ethnographers have been exploring, which can be roughly categorized under the kind of broad term computational ethnography. I've added a reading on this in the Moodle resources for this week to a journal article which concentrates on pattern analysis. I found this quite fascinating because it's usually outside of the scope of ethnography, and it's certainly outside of the scope of what we can currently do in the subject, but I still think it's worth knowing about and thinking about the potential of larger scale applications of ethnographic research. Computational research, however, is not what we would call digital ethnography. We'll talk more about digital ethnography later in the subject, and why I have problems with that term. But there are also other terms that are used to describe this approach to ethnography, including virtual ethnography that looks at the world of video games, and netnography, which has historically looked at the way people use the internet and, of course, now social media. Another emerging trend in ethnographic research can be categorized under the broad umbrella of sensory ethnography. This is a formalization of a very ancient practice of making sense of the experiences of texts, everyday events, through images, sights, sounds, and even physical taste. One of the leading academics of this type of research, Sarah Pink, argues that sensory ethnography is more than a method, that it is a methodology. I've added a chapter from Pink's book on sensory ethnography to the Moodle site. This is a very interesting section on design ethnography, which was actually quite new to me, so I'm exploring that and hopefully talk about that later in the session. So that's definitely worth exploring if you're interested in the application of ethnography to design and design thinking. Lastly is autoethnography. This is a crossover, again, between method and methodology. As Carolyn Ellis describes in the reading this week, autoethnography is an approach to research and writing that systematically seeks to analyze personal experience in order to better understand cultural experience. There are several different kinds of autoethnography, including evocative autoethnography and the more analytical approaches, and we're going to discuss that in the second part of this lecture.